All right, so let's talk about our routes, controllers, and views. In particular, we've already talked about things being RESTful, but I want to go over it in more detail, and then we're going to come back and we're going to come back in more detail. It's really one of the more critical aspects of our design at the web app level, is trying to figure out something that is that fits with this notion of being RESTful. So bear with us, bear with me, I guess, to go as we go through this. And again, we'll keep coming back to this material and do it in more depth. But so for now, I wanted to convey a notion about RESTful. All right, that I think might be missing, or I haven't covered well yet. You know, there's a big idea with things being RESTful that this is what I would have you as a takeaway, if anything, which is to think of your web app like it is a service with an application programming interface. Or API. Now, one of the problems with defining it in these terms is many of you are probably like, well, what do you mean by service and what do you mean by application programming interface? So a service, the book talks a lot about this, and it's really this notion that you're building a website, it's out there, it's on the network, and it can respond to requests. It does stuff for you. It's this entity out there living. It's a server that responds to requests. You ask it for something and it gives you back. It's a service. So it's basically a piece of software that's on the network. Okay, so it's acting as a server, and you as a client, you would talk to it and you would send it a request and get responses back, which of course you're like, well, that's what you've told us these websites are, so yes. But often traditionally in history with regard to our website development, people may not have always thought about them as a service, as something that someone's programming against. Instead, when I, for example, began my career as a software developer working for a web startup, we didn't think of it this way at all. We entirely thought of it as that we had a website that was composed of pages. And this page, it looks like this, and it's got maybe this HTML form on it, and that form will submit itself to this page, and that page will then process that, and then, then you'll be on that page. And then, oh, maybe there's another form, and then you submit it, and maybe it comes back to that same page, maybe it takes you to another page. So you would have this whole web of pages where on this page you run code and you process some input to that code, but it was very much like, yeah, I have pages, and these pages have programming code tied behind them. And this, you're like, that doesn't sound too bad, and it's not that bad. If you've ever seen PHP, played around with it, it has a model that is very much like this, where you write some file and you give it a PHP extension, and then when a request comes into the server for that file, instead of just sending that file back, it runs the code in that file. If anything, any form has been posted along with that request for that file, that data comes in and it runs as part of that. It's a pretty simple model to actually build against. And you might all suddenly be wondering, why are we wasting our time talking about RESTful and thinking of ourselves of like a service? And I think that's because what people have found is that this is a better way to architect your websites. Oh, I'm running pages that have code in them, and then I send you to other pages and this and that, is not a mindset that's very effective for growing out and building a good website. In particular, that sort of infrastructure almost always embeds the code, all of our code with all of our user interface. And so everything is tightly enmeshed. It's really hard to grow our website. It just has a lot of design issues with it. So when we go to the model view controller, we also, besides the separation of, basically our user interface from our the actions with our models, mediated by the controller, we're able to really get into as well this other level of design where we go, oh, we understand the way web apps should work, and they should work in a RESTful fashion. And if we program our websites in this way, it gives us a standard design pattern that everyone on the team understands. And it also allows us, hopefully, eventually, for our website to potentially go so far as to even function not just returning HTML, but we could return other data objects like JSON. We could very easily convert ourselves to be the back end for a front end that's using something with JavaScript and become more Ajax-like. There's a lot of big advantages to this way of thinking about things, and so that's why we're going to do this, and why we're talking about it. So that's what a service again. So what about this application programming interface? Let's talk about what I mean by that. I think the way to understand application programming interfaces is for you to think about back to your Java programs. So this is what you learned in 121 and 240. You wrote a Java program, and so when you write your program, you do it as a collection of objects. All right, this is the foundation of your object-oriented programming. You make an object, it stores its state, it has an interface. And in fact, this notion is that each object has a public interface. All right. That is defined by its public methods. All right. So, and then as well as hidden inside the object is its data and implementation. And this was taught to you as a real fundamental design principle for software. We don't want the entire guts of our objects available to other objects. Private parts are private. You shouldn't be touching other objects' private parts. All right, so we have these public methods. It allows us to hide the information inside that object. They form then what is to think of it as the interface. This is all the ways that you can interact, with this object. It defines, basically, it's like a small little programming interface. if you want to think of, so an application programming interface, you could think of it as all of the objects which are publicly visible and their publicly visible methods, okay? That forms the whole applications programming interface. And so now when you wrote your programs, you didn't ever think of it this way. No one ever talked to your program. It was all within your program. You had these objects and some of them had public methods and so forth and so on. But you could, it's not too much work, it is to take Java code and make it into, so it's like a library. So it doesn't have, a library is basically a Java program without a main method, okay? With no class to drive it and to make everything happen. It's just a library. There's all of these classes that are defined and they've got a bunch of public methods on them. So if you can have a library, and that library is basically, the application programming interface for, a whole collection of code, so to speak. When we say application programming interface, it really is as though we're talking about, we've got some application and we've got a way for other programs to talk to it and to get it to do things, okay? I think the biggest example really is your operating system. It provides a programming interface so that the programs can do things like read and write files on the file system. They can spawn other programs, can do threads, there's a whole huge application programming interface made available so that you can do the graphics and the windowing and all these sorts of things. So these are fundamental to the building blocks of computer systems, that we build these parts, and these parts expose some part of them to allow other parts to communicate with them. So at the lowest level, we've got objects, in a program or in some sort of library that we put together. At a higher level, they're bundled up as a sort of an application programming interface and so forth and so on. The idea here is, think about your web app as, it's there, it's not there just as, oh yeah, I'm providing HTML pages and people go from page to page to page. It has a layer to it, a functionality to it, where I could talk to it back and forth using the HTTP requests along with appropriate paths. That forms our routes. And I could know, oh yeah, I want to add a new book to the system. Well, I form that with a post to like /books, and I pass in additional things like a title and author as parameters, and this application, this web app that's running, will go and make a book and send me back some sort of response that tells me it's made it. In ours, we're always going to be returning HTML, but we could return other things. And so think of it that we could actually just drive it by sending these HTTP requests and paths with parameter data along into it and back and forth, and could drive it. Much like you saw in Homework 5, where it's like, I'm going to run a command to add something to the list. I'm going to run a command to delete something from the list. These are very discrete sort of notions of, I have a command and I want this application to do something, and it gives me back a response. That's the mindset of RESTful that we need to get into. Not so much the mindset of, I've got web pages and I want to go from this web page to the other web page. Now, so that's the big idea. I will tell you though, when push comes to shove, and you can't come up with a good RESTful system, think about it in terms of pages, and you just got to get things built. All right. All right. So, but I'll come back to that point. I still want to stress that this restfulness is a really good way to think of it. When basically, we want to think of our web app in the same way. As we were talking about with this Java program, basically, what are its components? What are the parts of it what are their public-facing methods? So think about it in terms of there's some parts, okay? And there's going to be some methods. Now, I say components, but to a large extent, when we talk about RESTful design, we're going to be ending up talking about the notion that there are resources. All right. That there's something that there's a resource there and we can create them, we can modify them, we can see them, and we can get rid of them. Okay. And so that's our mindset. We're going to always be thinking about these actions that we're going to be doing to manage these resources. There are some other things as well we'll get to when I have time to come back to REST in more detail. But that's the big thing. It's like, all right, well, let me think about my web app in this way. What are these sorts of things that I'm going to have in it that are going to be managed by it? And what are these public-facing methods going to be for them? And so as such, you form your app's API by defining a method in terms of, first thing, what's my HTTP verb going to be? Is it going to be a get? Is it going to be a post? Is it going to be a patch? Or is it going to be a delete? You will see also references to talking about put, but in Rails, patch has largely supplanted the use of put. All right, so I've got a verb. And then what is my path going to be? All right, these two together, you can kind of basically think of them as the name of a method. So just like our classes, when we do object-oriented programming, that public method has a name. This is kind of like the name of a method for our web app, okay? Because we're going to be able to end up accessing code running on our app. It's the way that someone, we call methods on objects by their name. We're going to basically call our web app to do work by saying, yeah, I'm going to do a get to this path and I want you to return me some information. Or, oh, I'm going to patch to this path, which basically says, I want you to, and I'm going to send you some data and I want you to change this underlying resource to edit, to update it, all right? So for path, for example, this might be something like, you might have, again, something like /movies and some ID, So you've got some path that tells you in combination what to do. So if we get movies / and we have like a numeric ID there of some sort, we would get information about whatever movie that was from our system. All right. Then we do have this thing in Rails that we call the params. All right. Which is a hash. You've seen this in homework 6, or you will soon when you look at it. And we get params. They come from things in the path. Comes from the query string. That's in the URL. So the path is part of this. And so where this, for example, might be a numeric ID, that can be one of our values in the params. The query string, which could be after this with the question mark and name value pairs, that gives us more params. And then as well, our post with a form, or our patch, or rdelete. All of these can send along data that end up in our params. Well, what are params? Well, params is short for parameters. And these are the parameters of our method, so to speak. So this is the way to, this is the big idea, the way to be thinking about things with your web app is not as much as I have pages going to pages and so forth and so on. Sure, you're eventually going to have to design this user interface and what's the user flow and how are they getting around it. But behind that are the key methods that you enable your app to actually do. Okay, that's a big step. Like, wait a minute, I've got this user interface and I'm going to put all this HTML and all this sort of stuff. But yes, behind all of it is a set of routes, which basically is your definition, your public application programming interface, so to speak, for your web app that you're telling the world, oh, when I get a get and I get this path, all right, and then you'll pass me in various parameters that I'm ready for, I'll go and do something for you, okay? So this is basically, you're putting together a method, and as well you're defining what the parameters are. Now, the parameters largely are not set in as part of the routes, except for where they show up in these placeholder points of the route. Other than that, the parameters come in the form, largely come in the forms of the posts of forms, so that data comes in. And likewise, there can be things in the query string that you're going to use. Those form the parameters, just like in Java. We've got a name and we've got parameters to our method. Our method then runs and returns something or does something to the system, changes it in some way, changes that object's internal state in some manner. This is the way that we drive our web apps, by defining these things. And then on top of it, yes, we've got a nice user interface, but that user interface is driving the underlying app through various forms being posted, people clicking on links to get things, and so forth and so on. We can understand our app at this level, and that's the real powerful thought of this RESTful methodology. All right, so that's the public-facing interface. That's basically thinking about coming up with what is our route going to be. And with that, though, we then also need to think about how do we get anything done then? If those are our methods, how do we get things done? How do we run some code? All right, so again, behind these, what we might call our public methods of our web app, are our controller objects. Our app is going to have many different controller objects. In Homework 6, we have a single model and we have a single controller. We have several routes that use that controller and then views attached to that, but it's basic books. It's very simple. It's one table in the database. We are going to have, you're going to be able to, your apps are going to be made up of many controllers. And this is one of our ways that we componentize and manage the complexity of our app, just the same way that when you write a Java program, you write a whole bunch of different classes, and the classes are responsible for different functions and behaviors in your Java program. Our controller objects are going to handle different parts of our application. So each controller is responsible for a subset of the app, as I just said. And in general, when talking about resources, we have one controller for each resource. For example, a books controller that we have in homework 6. All right. All right. So how do we go about this? How do we go about tying things together between our routes and our controller? Well, we use basically a configuration file. This routes.rb file, which is found in the config folder of our application in Rails. This is where we wire things up. This I actually like the fact that it's configurable, although there is some convention used as part of it. But we connect basically the public method, which is, the name that we've given with our HTTP verb and the path. That forms sort of the name. And we're going to say we have to tie that to some name in our actual code. Okay, this is where we can tie it to the controller method that we want to actually run. So it's like, how do we wire up the internal methods of our application? We've got to have these objects and they've got to have methods. How do we get them to be sort of public facing on the web? Oh, again, it's those routes. We've picked an HTTP verb and a path that forms the equivalent of a name, and we can make requests to that name, via our web browser and any other programming tool as well, by the way. It's not just web browsers. And we then know how to, I have that request. I'm going to go run this piece of code now in my software, this controller method, and I will pass into it all the parameters that I've been passed as part of that web request to that controller method. All right, so what's the format of this file look like? It can be, you can make it really complex, but let's keep it really simple. So routes.ruby format in its simplest form is as follows. We go with some HTTP verb. So we write a get, it's all lowercase, post, patch, delete. All right, so we do our verb, then we give a string, which is our path. Okay, we would write something like /movies in there. Then, so that's like defining the method name. Okay, then what are we going to connect it to? So we go to : and we give it a string where we give it a controller, and we use a hash mark. Okay, and then the action. So this is a method in the controller. So we call them controller actions, but they are controller methods. This controller, this is a name, okay, where this basically is some prefix that we're giving here, underscore controller.rb. So we might, for example, have written books here, which means it's going to be in the file books underscore controller.rb, which means the actual controller's name is going to be capital books controller when we get in there. It's going to be the class name. All right. Don't ask me why it has to be this way. We need some way I mean, we need some way of knowing what file the doggone thing is in, and we need to know eventually what the actual class is called. So all our controllers classes will be called something controller, and they'll all have a file format. So this will always be camel case for the name of the class, and the file format, the file name will be in snake case, all lowercase with underscores, where it's the something underscore controller.rb. This allows our routes to figure out where everything is. And if we violate this, it does not work. It will not work if we don't follow these conventions. All right, so that's one way to do it. Or we can actually tack on a little bit more. So we can do an HTTP verb. Again, we've got a path to, and we're going to say what our controller name is, pound what the action is. And again, this is the method that we want to run when someone requests with this verb, this path. We can add on an as, which is pretty cool. I'm going to give it this string, which is some prefix. And this is the used as what we want to produce a helper method, helper methods for us. So these are the, it would be, you know, prefix underscore path and prefix underscore URL. So when we give an as, so we could just have this is fine. And it will map from this route, this basically our method name, to running this code in our system. If we want some way to refer to this route and use it in all of our views, which in our controller, which ends up being super helpful as well when we get to automated testing, we're going to want to use it there as well. For certain routes, so a good example to follow is when you look at those resource routes. So when we say something is a resource, not all of them actually have the particular helper method, but this will let it go ahead and set this up for us. All right, so I'll give you one quick example here, and this is to get slash, you know, songs to, we have a songs controller and we have an index method and we say as colon songs. My apologies for the not straight line. So we could have a line like this in our routes to route a request of a get request to slash songs. It's going to call the code in the songs controller and the index method. It's going to pass in all the parameters to that method. And if we want to, and we'll have some helper methods like songs path and songs URL. All right, I'll take it up from there in another video.